The text that changed everything. Have you ever sacrificed everything for someone you loved, only to discover they saw you as nothing more than a convenience? Imagine giving decades of your life to your family, believing every sacrifice was building something meaningful, only to receive a message that shattered your heart in a matter of seconds. Today's story isn't just about money or inheritance. It's about respect, betrayal, and the moment one father realized he had been financing his own heartbreak. Stay with me, because what happened next completely changed this family's future forever. Before we begin, I want to know who's watching today. Drop your name, the city you're watching from, and one hobby you enjoy in the comments below. I love reading where everyone is tuning in from. And if stories about family, success, and life lessons inspire you, don't forget to subscribe to Royal Rich Chronicles and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss what's coming next. A lifetime of building and one message that destroyed it. My name is Douglas Carter. At 68 years old, I thought I'd already seen life's hardest moments. For over 4 decades, I worked as a structural engineer. My career revolved around designing bridges that survived hurricanes, office towers that could withstand earthquakes, and buildings strong enough to protect thousands of lives. Every blueprint demanded precision. Every decision carried responsibility. I understood pressure. I understood balance. I understood what caused structures to collapse. What I never realized was that the weakest foundation I'd ever built wasn't made of concrete or steel. It was my own family. That Tuesday evening seemed perfectly ordinary. Rain tapped softly against the garage windows while the comforting scent of fresh-cut pine drifted through the room. My old radio played gentle jazz in the background as I carefully sanded the edges of a handmade bookshelf. It wasn't just another woodworking project. It was for my grandson, Leo. A week earlier, he'd turned 7, and lately he'd become obsessed with dinosaurs. Every visit, he'd excitedly tell me the difference between a Tyrannosaurus and a Triceratops, laughing as if he'd discovered the greatest secret on Earth. So I decided to surprise him. I spent nearly 3 weeks measuring every shelf, smoothing every corner, and carving tiny dinosaur footprints into the sides where only he would notice them. I imagined the excitement on his face. That thought alone made every late night worth it. Then my phone vibrated across the workbench. The harsh buzzing echoed through the quiet garage. Without thinking much of it, I brushed the sawdust from my hands and glanced at the screen. It was a text from my son, Brandon, my only child, the boy I'd raised alone after losing his mother more than 20 years earlier. A small smile crossed my face. Maybe he wanted to thank me for helping repair the leaking kitchen faucet 2 days earlier. Maybe Leo loved the apples I'd brought over. Maybe they wanted to stop by for dinner. Instead, I opened the message, and everything inside me went silent. Dad, Brittany and I talked. You come over too often. It's overwhelming. We need space to be our own family. Please don't come to the house anymore unless we specifically invite you. We just want peace. I stared at the words. Then I read them again. Maybe another message was coming. Maybe he was joking. Maybe he'd sent it while angry and would apologize in the next minute. Nothing came. The screen slowly dimmed until it reflected my own stunned face. For several long moments, I simply stood there. The sandpaper remained frozen in my hand. Outside, the rain continued falling as though nothing had happened. Inside, it felt like someone had quietly removed the roof over my head. Only 2 days earlier, I'd visited their house. Not to interfere, not to criticize. I brought Brittany organic fruit because she'd mentioned starting healthier habits. I fixed the kitchen faucet because Brandon admitted he didn't know how. Then I spent 20 wonderful minutes chasing Leo around the backyard while his parents scrolled through their phones. I thought I was helping. Apparently, I was unwanted. I slowly set the unfinished bookshelf onto the workbench. The tiny dinosaur footprints I carved suddenly felt painfully unfinished. For the first time in years, I wondered whether Leo would ever receive it. I walked into my kitchen, poured myself a glass of water, and leaned against the counter. The house felt unusually quiet, almost unfamiliar. My eyes drifted toward the calendar hanging on the refrigerator. Tomorrow was the 15th. Most people would have seen just another date. I saw responsibilities, mortgage payment, private school tuition, insurance, monthly transfers, bills for the beautiful house Brandon proudly called his. A house I still paid for. I stood there remembering every financial commitment I'd quietly carried over the years. College tuition, wedding expenses, furniture, vacations, unexpected emergencies, credit cards, home renovations. Whenever Brandon struggled, I stepped in without hesitation. Not because he demanded it, because I believe that's what fathers did. But now, those same people wanted peace. Peace from my presence, not from my wallet. The realization hit harder than the text itself. For years, I believed my family needed me. Now I wondered, did they simply need my bank account? I picked up my phone once more. My thumb hovered over the keyboard. 100 emotional responses flooded my mind. I could remind him of every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every opportunity I'd created, every check I'd written. Instead, I erased every sentence. I typed only 2 simple words. Understood. Then I pressed send. No anger, no guilt, no argument. Just silence. That night, I lay awake staring into the darkness. Engineers solve problems by studying failures. And for the first time, I began calculating the real weight holding my relationship with my son together. The answer frightened me. It wasn't love. It wasn't gratitude. It wasn't family. It was money. And once I finally accepted that truth, I realized something had to change. But what happened the very next morning made me understand just how deep the problem really was. The morning he came back for money. The next morning began like every other Tuesday I'd lived through for the past several years. At least, that's what I thought. The sunrise painted soft golden streaks across my living room window as I brewed a fresh pot of black coffee. The comforting aroma filled the quiet house, but something felt different. The silence no longer felt lonely. It felt revealing. For the first time in years, there wasn't a phone call asking me to fix something. No request to transfer money. No emergency waiting for me before breakfast. I carried my coffee into the living room, unfolded the business section of the newspaper, and tried convincing myself to focus on the headlines. But my mind kept drifting back to Brandon's message. We want peace. Those 4 words echoed louder than the ticking grandfather clock across the room. Then, bang, bang, bang. Someone knocked on my front door. Not politely, not patiently. Rapid, impatient knocks that sounded more like demands than greetings. I glanced at the clock. 7:15 a.m. Only one person I knew knocked like that. I walked calmly toward the entrance and opened the door. Standing there was Brandon, dressed in his expensive navy blue business suit. Hair perfectly styled. Luxury watch gleaming beneath the morning sun. If someone had seen him standing there, they'd assume he had everything under control. But I noticed something different. His smile wasn't genuine. His eyes weren't warm. He wasn't there because he regretted the message he'd sent. He was there because he needed something. "Morning, Dad," he said casually before stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. He walked through my hallway as though he still owned the place. "I hope you've got coffee ready. I'm running late." I quietly closed the door behind him. Without asking permission, Brandon grabbed one of my mugs from the cabinet, poured himself coffee, took a sip, and immediately frowned. "You really should buy better coffee beans," he muttered. "This tastes terrible." I couldn't help but stare at him. 12 hours earlier, he told me not to come near his family. Now he was criticizing my coffee inside my own kitchen. He didn't notice the silence. Or maybe he simply didn't care. He leaned against the counter, scrolling through emails on his phone as though last night's message had never existed. Finally, he looked up. "Oh, about that text." He waved one hand dismissively. "Don't make it into a huge thing." I said nothing. He continued. "Brittany's just stressed. She feels like she can't relax when people keep stopping by. We just need some boundaries." He smiled awkwardly. "You understand that, right? Boundaries. Interesting word." Apparently, I was close enough to pay their bills, but too close to visit. I nodded slowly. "I understand." His shoulders relaxed instantly. He assumed the conversation was over. He assumed I'd accepted my new role. A father from a distance. A wallet from up close. "Great," he said cheerfully. Then he reached inside his jacket and unfolded a repair invoice. He slid it across the kitchen table toward me. Bad timing, but the SUV transmission blew yesterday. I glanced at the paper. The total came to $2,400. The dealership won't release the car until it's paid, Brandon explained. My credit card's maxed out because we already booked next month's vacation. He checked his watch. I've got an important client meeting. Then he looked directly at me. So, I need you to take care of this. Not, could you help? Not, would you mind? Just, take care of it. The confidence in his voice surprised me. There wasn't an ounce of embarrassment. No apology for the text. No gratitude for years of support. Only expectation. As if paying his bills was simply another responsibility I'd wake up to every morning. I looked down at the invoice again, then back at my son. Memories flooded my mind one after another. Helping him buy his first car, paying every semester of college, making phone calls that opened doors in his career, covering medical bills, funding family vacations, buying the beautiful home where he now lived. Every time life became difficult, I'd stepped in, not because he demanded it, because I wanted him to succeed. But somewhere along the journey, helping had quietly become enabling. I wasn't raising an independent man anymore. I was maintaining someone else's lifestyle. And somehow, neither of us had noticed until now. I slowly walked over to the kitchen drawer. Behind me, I heard Brandon exhale with relief. He thought the problem had already been solved. He knew exactly where I kept my checkbook. He'd watched me write hundreds of checks over the years. College, mortgage, insurance, vacations, unexpected emergencies. To him, this was simply another Tuesday. I pulled out the leather checkbook, then removed the fountain pen I'd received when I retired after 40 years as an engineer. Heavy, elegant, reliable, unlike the relationship standing across from me. Brandon smiled. I knew you'd understand, Dad. He picked up his coffee again. Once Brittany cools off, maybe we'll invite you over in a couple weeks. Maybe. The word echoed inside my head. Maybe I'd be allowed to visit the grandson I'd helped raise. Maybe, if I behaved. I opened a checkbook, carefully wrote today's date, filled in the dealership's name, then wrote the amount, $2,400. Every stroke of the pen felt strangely symbolic. Not because of the money, because I realized this check represented far more than a transmission repair. It represented every boundary Brandon had just created. A father who stayed away, but continued paying. I signed my name, Douglas Carter. For a few seconds, I stared at the completed check. Then I slowly tore it free from the checkbook. The ripping sound filled the silent kitchen. Brandon reached out confidently. Perfect, he said. I've got to run. But instead of handing it over, I held it between my fingers. I looked straight into my son's eyes. You told me last night that you wanted peace. His smile faded. Yeah. So, I'm giving it to you. He frowned. What? I smiled gently. Not with anger. Not with revenge. With clarity. Then, very slowly, I tore the check directly down the middle. The sound seemed impossibly loud. Brandon froze. His outstretched hand remained suspended in midair. His eyes widened. Before he could even speak, I tore each half again. Tiny pieces drifted onto my kitchen floor like blue confetti. Dad, his voice barely escaped. What are you doing? I calmly placed the torn pieces on the table. I'm respecting your boundaries. His face turned crimson. You've got to be kidding me. No, you can't be serious. I've never been more serious. You know I need that car. I folded my arms. And you're a grown man. Silence. Heavy. Uncomfortable. Unavoidable. For the first time in his life, Brandon realized something had changed. The bank of Dad had just closed its doors, and neither of us knew what would happen next. But if Brandon thought losing one check was bad, he had absolutely no idea what I was about to do before lunchtime. The day I took back my life, Brandon stood frozen in my kitchen. The torn pieces of the check were scattered across the floor between us like the remains of a relationship neither of us wanted to admit had been falling apart for years. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the steady ticking of the old clock hanging above the refrigerator. Then his face twisted with anger. What is wrong with you? He shouted. His voice bounced off the walls. I just asked for help. I looked at him calmly. No, Brandon. I shook my head. You didn't ask. You expected. His mouth fell open. You've always helped me. And that's exactly the problem. He stared at me as if I had spoken another language. For 32 years, I'd rescued him from every mistake, every unpaid bill, every financial disaster, every poor decision. Every time life became difficult, I quietly stepped in. I convinced myself I was being a good father. Now I finally understood the truth. I hadn't been raising a capable man. I've been raising someone who believed consequences belong to other people. Brandon slammed both hands on my kitchen table. This is unbelievable. You're punishing me because Brittany asked for some space. No, I answered without raising my voice. I'm finally respecting your wishes. He laughed bitterly. Oh, come on. You know that's not what this is. You think you're teaching me some kind of lesson. I already learned one. He frowned. What lesson? I met his eyes. I learned that my value to this family depends entirely on what I can pay for. His expression changed for just a moment. Almost guilt. Almost. Then pride swallowed it. So you're just going to abandon us? I smiled sadly. I've supported you for over a decade. That's not abandonment. That's retirement. His eyebrows pulled together. What? I'm retiring from being your personal bank. The words landed harder than I'd expected. He looked stunned, then furious. So that's it. You're cutting me off? I'm treating you exactly the way you asked to be treated. I'll stay out of your family life. I'll stay out of your home. And from now on, I'll stay out of your finances too. For the first time since walking into my house, Brandon had no response. He simply stared. It was as though he'd never considered those two things might actually be connected. He wanted independence, but only emotionally. Financially, he still expected me to carry the weight. Finally, he grabbed his briefcase. Fine. His voice had become cold. If this is how you want it. He pointed toward me. Don't expect us to come crawling back. I nodded once. I wasn't expecting you to. His jaw tightened. You won't see Leo. There it was. The weapon I knew he'd eventually use. My grandson. The words hit my heart harder than the original text message. But I refused to let him see it. I hope that changes someday. He shook his head. No, it won't. Then he stormed toward the front door. Before leaving, he stopped without turning around. You've changed. I looked at his back. No, son. I finally woke up. The front door slammed so hard the windows rattled. Silence returned. But this time, it felt different. It wasn't the lonely silence of an empty house. It was the peaceful silence that follows a storm finally moving away. I slowly bent down and gathered the torn pieces of the check. For years, those checks had represented love. Today, they represented freedom. I dropped every piece into the trash. Then I looked toward the family calendar hanging on the refrigerator. The mortgage payment, the school tuition, insurance, utilities. Thousands of dollars left my accounts every month without a second thought. I suddenly realized something. Brandon hadn't simply grown dependent. I'd built the entire system myself. Engineers know something most people don't. When a bridge begins collapsing, you don't keep adding more support beams. Eventually, you have to close the bridge before someone gets killed. And that's exactly what I intended to do. I walked into my study and opened the small wooden cabinet where I kept important legal documents. Inside sat a thick blue folder. Carter Family Trust. I hadn't opened it in months. As I ran my fingers across the cover, memories came rushing back. The day my late wife and I signed those papers. The promise we'd made to protect future generations. The hope that everything we'd built would strengthen our family long after we were gone. Instead, it had become the very thing enabling my son's entitlement. I picked up my phone. There was only one person I trusted to help me fix this. I searched one familiar name. Sylvia Ross, our family attorney. She'd handled my wife's estate years earlier. She knew every asset I owned, every investment, every legal protection I'd carefully built over 4 decades. The phone rang twice. Douglas. Her calm voice came through the speaker. It's early. Is everything all right? I looked at the trust documents resting on my desk. No, I answered honestly. But it will be. There was a pause. I need to see you today. She immediately heard something different in my voice. This sounds serious. It is. Another brief silence. What happened? I looked out the window toward the quiet street. My family asked for peace, and I've decided to give it to them. I need to make changes. Permanent change. She didn't interrupt. She'd known me long enough to recognize determination when she heard it. Finally, she spoke. Come to my office. I'll clear my schedule. We'll go through everything. I thanked her and ended the call. For several moments, I simply sat there. The room felt strangely lighter. Not because this decision was easy. It wasn't. Every father wants to protect his child. Every grandfather wants to keep his family together. But there comes a moment when protecting someone from every consequence begins destroying them. Maybe I'd reached that moment years earlier. I was simply the last person to realize it. I grabbed my car keys, the blue trust folder, and my jacket. As I locked my front door behind me, I took one final look at the home I'd worked my entire life to build. For decades, I'd spent my career designing structures that could survive impossible pressure. Now, it was time to rebuild the most important structure of all, my own life. But what waited inside Sylvia's office would reveal a shocking truth, one that would completely change the future of my son, his family, and everything I had spent my life building. Before we continue, let me ask you something. If you found yourself in Douglas's position, would you have kept helping your son, or would you have done exactly what he did? Tell me your thoughts in the comments. And if you're enjoying this story, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to Royal Rich Chronicles. The biggest twists are still ahead. The truth hidden behind the trust. The drive to downtown Seattle felt longer than it ever had before. Rain tapped steadily against my windshield as I made my way through the morning traffic. Normally, I enjoy driving. It gave me time to think. But today my thoughts refused to settle. They kept replaying Brandon's face when I tore up that check. His disbelief, his anger, his certainty that I would eventually give in. For years, that's exactly what I'd done. Every argument ended the same way. Every crisis ended with me writing another check. Not this time. Today wasn't about revenge. It was about reality. As I pulled into the underground parking garage beneath the glass office tower, I switched off the engine and sat quietly for a moment. My hands rested on the steering wheel. 40 years as an engineer had taught me something important. You can't repair a building by pretending the cracks aren't there. Sooner or later, you have to expose the damage. I grabbed the blue trust folder from the passenger seat and headed upstairs. The one person who knew everything. Sylvia Ross had been more than my attorney. She had been my family's legal advisor for nearly 3 decades. She helped my late wife and me establish the Carter Family Trust. She handled our estate planning. She knew every investment, every property, every account. Most importantly, she knew how much of my wealth quietly flowed into Brandon's life every single month. When I stepped in her office, she looked up immediately. She didn't smile. She simply studied my face. I've never seen you look this determined, Douglas. I've never been this certain. She motioned toward the leather chair across from her desk. Seat. As soon as I did, she closed her office door. No interruptions. No phone calls. Just silence. She folded her hands together. So, what happened? I slowly slid the blue trust folder across her desk. They told me not to come to their house anymore. Her eyebrows lifted slightly. They said they wanted peace. She nodded but didn't interrupt. Then this morning, my son came asking for more money. Sylvia closed her eyes for just a second. I was afraid of that. You knew. She leaned back. Douglas, I've been worried for years. You just weren't ready to hear it. Her words stung because they were true. Every time she questioned another large transfer. Every time she'd suggested setting boundaries. Ide da fanda Brandon. He'll grow out of it. He just needs a little help. He's under pressure. Those have been my favorite excuses. Now, they sounded painfully naive. Sylvia turned toward her computer. Let's stop talking about feelings. Let's look at facts. She began typing. Within seconds, the printer beside her desk came alive. Pages poured out one after another. Bank transfers, mortgage statements, investment withdrawals, property records. She stacked everything neatly before sliding the pile toward me. Read the totals. I picked up the first page. At first, the numbers didn't seem real. Monthly mortgage payments, property taxes, homeowner's insurance, utilities, private school tuition, luxury vacations, credit card bailouts, vehicle repairs, kitchen renovation. Unexpected emergencies. Page after page, year after year. My fingers slowly tightened around the papers. I reached the final summary. My breathing stopped. Over the past 12 months alone, I'd spent well over $100,000 supporting Brandon's family. 100,000. I stared silently at the page, then quietly asked, "Is this accurate?" Sylvia nodded. Every penny. She folded her hands. "You've spent more maintaining your son's lifestyle this year than you've spent on yourself in nearly a decade." The room suddenly felt very quiet. Not because I couldn't afford it. I could. That wasn't the point. The painful realization was something far worse. Brandon genuinely believed he'd earned that lifestyle. He had no idea how much of it rested on my shoulders. Or perhaps he simply didn't care. Who really owned the house? I turned another page. There it was. The Oak Creek Drive property. The beautiful home Brandon proudly called his house. The same house where I was suddenly no longer welcome. I looked up. Sylvia, who legally owns it? She didn't hesitate. The Carter Family Trust. And Brandon? He has occupancy privileges only. No ownership. No equity. No legal claim. I slowly looked back at the paperwork. So, he doesn't own a single brick. She shook her head. Not one. The trust owns everything. The right to live there exists only because you allow it. Her words echoed my mind. All those years, listening to Brandon describe renovations, future additions, new landscaping, outdoor kitchens, swimming pool ideas. He'd spoken as though he were building his dream home. Legally, he was decorating someone else's investment. I closed the file. A strange mixture of sadness and disappointment settled over me, not because of the money, because I'd allowed the illusion to continue. The conversation that changed everything. Sylvia leaned forward. "Douglas, I need you to answer one question." I nodded. "If nothing changes, what do you think Brandon will be 5 years from now?" I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I imagined him, still calling whenever something broke, still expecting another transfer, still believing someone else would rescue him. Eventually I whispered, "Exactly where he is today." She nodded slowly. "And where will Leo be?" That question hit even harder. My grandson, an innocent child watching everything, learning from everything. Would he grow into another man who believed responsibility belonged to someone else? Or could this cycle finally end? Sylvia watched my face. "You've always wanted to protect your family. I know that. But sometimes, the hardest form of love is allowing someone to experience the consequences they've spent years avoiding." I looked toward the large office window, overlooking the city. People hurried along sidewalks below. Parents, workers, business owners, students. Millions of ordinary people earning their lives one day at a time. Then there was Brandon, living inside a carefully maintained fantasy. One-eyed financed. No more. I turned back toward Sylvia. "What happens if I decide to change everything?" She took a slow breath. "We begin restructuring the trust. We revoke occupancy rights. We terminate unnecessary financial support. We protect Leo's future directly. And legally, we stop treating your son like a dependent." The words sounded harsh. Yet strangely, they also sounded fair. I sat quietly for nearly a full minute. Then I made the hardest decision of my life. I looked Sylvia directly in the eyes. "Prepare the paperwork." She searched my face. "Are you absolutely certain?" For just a moment, I thought about Brandon as a little boy holding my hand on his first day of school. I remembered teaching him to ride a bicycle, helping with homework, celebrating birthdays, watching him become a father. Then I remembered the text. "Don't come to our house anymore." I remembered the invoice, the expectation, the entitlement. Finally, I nodded. "Yes, I'm done financing disrespect." Sylvia slowly opened a fresh legal file. She uncapped her pen. "Then let's begin." Neither of us realized it yet. But the documents she was about to prepare wouldn't just change one family's finances. They would completely dismantle the life Brandon believed could never be taken away. And when the first legal notice arrived at his front door, everything he thought he owned would begin slipping through his fingers. Before we continue, here's something I'd love to hear from you. If you had worked your entire life to build wealth for your family, Would you keep giving without limits? Or would you finally draw a line? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you're enjoying this journey, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Royal Rich Chronicles, because the biggest turning point is about to unfold. The first domino falls. There's an old saying that the loudest storms don't always begin with thunder. Sometimes, they begin with the quiet scratch of a lawyer's pen. 3 days after my meeting with Sylvia, everything was ready. Every document had been reviewed. Every legal requirement had been satisfied. Every signature had been placed exactly where it belonged. There would be no emotional confrontation, no dramatic speeches, no arguments over the phone. Just facts. Cold, undeniable facts. As an engineer, I'd spent my entire career trusting mathematics over emotions. Steel either held the weight or it didn't. The same principle applied here. Either my son respected the boundaries of our family, or he didn't. The paperwork simply reflected reality. A morning unlike any other. Thursday arrived cool and bright. The rain had finally passed, leaving behind crystal-clear skies and fresh morning air. I sat comfortably on my back porch with a cup of black coffee and today's newspaper resting beside me. Birds chirped in the maple tree overlooking the yard. For the first time in weeks, my mind felt surprisingly calm. Not because the situation no longer hurt. It hurt deeply, but because uncertainty had disappeared. The decision had already been made. Now, life simply had to catch up. At exactly 9:30 a.m., my phone rang. It was Sylvia. "Good morning, Douglas." "Morning. It's done." She sounded as calm as ever. "The notice has officially been filed." I took a slow sip of coffee. "And the courier picked it up 15 minutes ago. He should arrive before noon." I looked toward the peaceful garden my late wife and I had planted years earlier. White roses gently swayed in the breeze. She had loved mornings like this. I wondered what she would think of everything happening now. Would she be disappointed? Or would she quietly tell me I'd waited far too long? Sylvia interrupted my thoughts. "There's still time to stop this, if that's what you want." I smiled softly. "No." There wasn't even a second of hesitation. This should have happened years ago. She remained silent. Then she quietly replied, "I think you're doing the hardest thing a parent can ever do." "What?" "Loving your child enough to stop rescuing him." After we ended the call, I sat alone for several minutes. My coffee had grown cold. I barely noticed. Somewhere across town, a delivery truck was carrying an envelope that would completely change my son's life. The house filled with illusions. Meanwhile, life inside Brandon's beautiful home looked exactly as it always had. The smell of freshly baked pastries drifted through the large, open kitchen. Brittany moved confidently between marble countertops while cheerful music played through hidden ceiling speakers. She was preparing for a weekend gathering. Again, luxury shopping bags covered the dining room table. Designer candles, imported cheeses, expensive wine, fresh flowers. Everything had to look perfect. Her friends, Tiffany and Jessica, were coming Saturday afternoon. She wanted the house to impress them. Like always, she glanced proudly around the enormous kitchen. "I think we should finally build that outdoor pizza oven," she called toward the living room. Brandon looked up from his laptop. "Yeah, and maybe extend the patio?" "Definitely. We've earned it." He smiled confidently. "After this next bonus, we'll probably remodel the backyard completely." Neither of them mentioned the text message. Neither mentioned our argument. In their minds, life had already returned to normal, because every previous conflict with me had ended exactly the same way. I'd eventually apologize. I'd eventually pay. I'd eventually fix everything. Why should this time be different? Brandon closed his laptop and stretched. "My meeting tomorrow should lock in the downtown project. If that closes," he grinned, "we'll finally start living the way we deserve." Brittany laughed. "I've already been looking at outdoor furniture." She held up her phone. "What do you think about this Italian dining set?" Brandon barely looked. "If you like it, buy it." She smiled. "I knew you'd say that." Neither one realized. The financial foundation beneath their feet had already begun disappearing. The knock at the door. Just before noon, the doorbell rang. Brittany frowned. "Are you expecting someone?" Brandon shook his head. "No." He walked casually toward the front entrance. When he opened the door, A man wearing a FedEx uniform stood outside, holding a large overnight envelope. Brandon Carter? Yes. I need your signature. Brandon scribbled his name without thinking. Thanks. The driver handed him the envelope. Have a great day. The truck pulled away. Brandon closed the door behind him. Brittany looked over from the kitchen. What is it? No idea. He turned the package over. His smile slowly disappeared. Printed across the front were words he hadn't expected to see. Legal documents. His heartbeat quickened. Who's it from? Brittany asked. Brandon looked closer. The return address read, Ross and Associates Attorneys at Law. His stomach tightened. Probably paperwork. He tried sounding casual. Maybe something about the trust. But even he didn't believe his own explanation. He carefully opened the envelope. Inside sat several official documents. The first page immediately caught his attention. Large bold letters stretched across the top. Notice to vacate. His eyes widened. He blinked once. Twice. Surely he'd misunderstood. He read the title again. The words hadn't changed. What is it? Brittany asked, walking closer. Brandon didn't answer. His face had gone completely pale. She grabbed the papers from his shaking hands. As she scanned the first page, her confident smile vanished. What? No, this has to be some kind of mistake. She flipped to the second page, then the third. Each page made things worse. 30 days. Occupancy rights revoked. Trustee authorization. Legal compliance. Property sale pending. Everything was official. Everything was signed. Everything was enforceable. Brandon leaned against the wall. His breathing became shallow. He can't. Brittany looked at him with growing panic. Call him. Right now. He pulled out his phone. His fingers trembled so badly that he dialed the wrong number twice. Finally, the call connected. It rang once, twice, 3 times. Then, voicemail. He hung up immediately. Called again. Straight to voicemail. Again. Voicemail. Again. Nothing. For the first time in his adult life. His father wasn't waiting to rescue him. He wasn't even answering the phone. Brandon slowly lowered the device. His voice barely escaped. I think he's serious. The silence inside that enormous house suddenly felt overwhelming. It was the same house they'd proudly shown off to friends. The same house they'd decorated. The same house they believed would always be theirs. Now, every room suddenly felt temporary. Every wall felt borrowed. Every luxury seemed uncertain. Neither Brandon nor Brittany realized it yet. But this envelope wasn't the end of their problems. It was only the first domino. Because while they stood frozen in shock, another decision had already been set into motion. One that would threaten Brandon's career, his reputation, and everything he believed he had earned. Before we move on, let me ask you something. Have you ever seen someone mistake generosity for entitlement? At what point do you think helping someone becomes enabling them? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you're enjoying this story, please like, subscribe to Royal Rich Chronicles, and turn on notifications, because the next chapter changes everything. The party that fell apart. Some people believe the worst part of receiving bad news is the moment they hear it. They're wrong. The worst part is pretending everything is fine, while carrying a secret that threatens to destroy your entire world. That's exactly where Brandon found himself. For the next 24 hours, he barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the legal notice. 30 days. 30 days before the house he proudly called his own would no longer belong to him. 30 days before the illusion he'd spent years building came crashing down. Yet Saturday afternoon arrived anyway. And despite everything, the backyard barbecue was still happening. Keeping up appearances, the backyard looked like something straight out of a luxury lifestyle magazine. Fresh flowers decorated every table. Soft music drifted through hidden outdoor speakers. The expensive stainless steel grill glowed beneath the afternoon sun. Crystal glasses sparkled beside bottles of imported champagne. Neighbors passing by would have assumed they were looking at a family living the American dream. Only Brandon knew the truth. As he flipped burgers over the grill, his mind wasn't on the food. It was on the envelope hidden inside the kitchen drawer. The legal notice. He hadn't told anyone outside the house. Not his friends. Not his co-workers. not even the guests arriving one after another. He wasn't ready to admit the truth. Maybe, if he ignored it long enough, it would somehow disappear. But deep inside, he knew better. The perfect image. "Brandon," Brittany called from across the patio. "Hurry up. Our guests are here." She looked radiant in a white summer dress, laughing as she welcomed everyone through the backyard gate. Tiffany arrived first carrying an expensive bottle of wine. Jessica followed close behind with gourmet desserts. Both women immediately began complimenting the house. "I swear," Tiffany laughed, looking around the backyard. "Every time we visit, this place looks even more beautiful." Jessica smiled. "You two really know how to live." Brittany beamed with pride. "We've worked hard for it." Brandon heard those words from the grill. His hand tightened around the spatula. Worked hard. The phrase echoed painfully in his mind. Had they worked hard? Yes, but not nearly hard enough to afford this life on their own. He looked toward the enormous home, the imported stone patio, the luxury outdoor furniture, the landscape garden, every mortgage payment, every insurance bill, every tax payment. His father had quietly carried those expenses. Yet everyone believed Brandon had built this success himself, including Brandon. A conversation that stung. As everyone settled around the outdoor table, Tiffany raised her glass. "So, when are you guys finally putting in that pizza oven?" Brittany laughed. "We're talking to a contractor next month, and Brandon wants to extend the patio." Jessica smiled. "I figured you two would eventually buy the lot next door." Brandon forced a laugh. "We've definitely talked about it." Every sentence felt heavier than the last. Every lie came easier than the truth. His chest tightened. He reached for a glass of water. His hands were shaking. "You okay?" Jessica asked. "You look exhausted." "Busy week." Brandon smiled weakly. "Huge business deal. Lots of meetings." He hated hearing himself speak, but admitting reality felt impossible. Then came the knock. Just as Brandon returned to the grill, the front doorbell rang. Nobody paid much attention. Brittany smiled toward him. "Can you get that?" "I'm Busse." He nodded toward the burgers. "You grab it." She disappeared inside the house. A minute later, they heard another knock. Harder this time. Then footsteps. Then silence. Suddenly, Brittany appeared in the backyard. She looked confused. "Brandon, there's another courier." He frowned. "Another one?" "They said it requires your signature." His heartbeat instantly doubled. "No," he whispered under his breath. "Not again." He wiped his hands on a towel and walked toward the front door. The FedEx driver stood patiently holding another overnight envelope. "Mr. Brandon Carter?" "Yes." "Signature, please." Brandon hesitated. Every instinct told him not to touch it, but refusing wouldn't change anything. He signed. The driver handed him the envelope and left. Standing alone in the hallway, Brandon stared at it. His pulse thundered in his ears. The return address looked painfully familiar. Ross and Associates. Again, his stomach dropped. The secret couldn't stay hidden. "What is it?" Brittany asked quietly behind him. Brandon slowly opened the package. Inside, another set of legal papers. This time, the heading made his knees weak. Notice of property listing. The home was officially being prepared for sale. Professional photographs. Public listing. Showings. Open houses. Inspection dates. Everything had already been scheduled. The photographer would arrive Monday morning. Brandon's mouth went dry. He actually listed the house. Brittany grabbed the papers. No, he wouldn't. She turned page after page. Every signature, every legal seal, every deadline, everything was real. Suddenly, voices drifted in from the backyard. "Everything okay?" Tiffany called. Brittany looked at Brandon. Panic filled her eyes. "What do we tell them?" Brandon swallowed hard. He folded the documents and slipped them into his pocket. "We tell them nothing." He forced a smile. "Nobody needs to know, but secrets have a way of showing themselves, especially when they're heavy enough to crush the person carrying them." Brandon returned to the grill. His smile looked convincing. His voice sounded almost normal. But inside, everything was collapsing. The lie that broke him. A few minutes later, Jessica noticed how distracted he looked. "Brandon," she tilted her head. "Did your business deal finally close?" It was an innocent question, an easy opportunity to tell the truth. Instead, Brandon looked around at everyone's smiling faces. He looked at Brittany. She silently begged him with her eyes. Please, don't embarrass us. He understood exactly what she wanted. She needed the illusion to survive. So he smiled. Barely. Yeah. He nodded. It finally closed. Everyone cheered. Tiffany lifted her champagne glass. I knew you'd pull it off. Brittany wrapped her arm around his shoulder proudly. My husband never loses. The guests applauded. Brandon smiled for them, but the smile never reached his eyes. As flames danced beneath the grill, he felt as though his own life was burning alongside the burgers. The legal documents pressed against his pocket like a weight made of stone. Every compliment felt undeserved. Every congratulation sounded hollow. Every laugh reminded him how close he was to losing everything. He wasn't celebrating success anymore. He was performing it, and performances always come to an end. What Brandon didn't realize was that the very next stormy night, desperation would drive him to his father's front door, and that confrontation would become the most explosive moment their family had ever faced. If you made it this far, thank you for being part of the Royal Rich Chronicles family. I'm curious, what's the biggest lesson you've learned from this story so far? Let me know in the comments. And if you're enjoying the journey, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because the next chapter delivers a confrontation you'll never forget. The storm that brought them back. Sometimes life has a strange way of forcing people to knock on the very door they once closed. Brandon spent the rest of Saturday pretending everything was under control. He smiled for photos. He laughed at jokes. He poured drinks for guests who had no idea his entire world had begun to collapse. But the second the last car disappeared down the street, the mask came off. The backyard fell silent. The laughter vanished, and reality walked back into the house with him. The truth neither of them could escape. Brandon tossed the legal documents onto the kitchen island. They're selling it. His voice sounded flat, almost lifeless. Brittany picked up the papers again, hoping she'd somehow miss something. She hadn't. Every page confirmed the same painful truth. Professional photographs scheduled. The property listed for sale. 30-day notice still active. Every deadline legally enforceable. She dropped into one of the kitchen chairs. This can't be happening. Brandon ran both hands through his hair. It is. She looked at him desperately. You have to fix this. I've tried. Call him again. He won't answer. Then drive over there. He'll throw me out. Brittany slammed her hand against the countertop. I don't care. You have to do something. The panic that had been hiding behind her confident smile finally surfaced. What happens if our friends find out? What happens when Leo asks why we're moving? What happens if we can't qualify for another mortgage? Question after question poured out of her. Brandon had no answers. For the first time in years, money couldn't solve the problem, because the person with the money had finally stopped saying yes. The silence before the storm. Sunday passed like a bad dream. Neither of them accomplished anything. Boxes remained untouched. The legal papers stayed spread across the dining table. Every phone call Brandon made ended the same way, straight to voicemail. He even left messages. Dad, please call me. Nothing. By evening, dark clouds rolled across the sky. Heavy rain began pounding against the windows. Lightning flashed in the distance. Inside the house, the atmosphere felt even darker. Leo sat quietly in the living room building a dinosaur puzzle, completely unaware of the fear surrounding him. Every now and then, he'd smile and hold up another completed piece. Dad, look. Brandon forced a smile. That's awesome, buddy. But the moment Leo looked away, his smile disappeared. Brittany noticed. We can't let him see us like this. Brandon nodded. I know, but he also knew children noticed far more than adults believed. Leo might not understand legal documents. He might not understand trusts, but he understood tension. He understood whispered conversations. He understood worried faces. And that realization hurt Brandon more than anything else. One last attempt. At nearly 10 o'clock that night, Brandon stood by the living room window watching the rain. Finally, he grabbed his car keys. I'm going. Brittany looked up. Now. Yes. It's late. I don't care. He has to listen. She stood and walked toward him. What if he refuses? Brandon hesitated. He won't. Even as he said it, he wasn't convinced. Still, he had no other choice. Minutes later, headlights cut through the rain as Brandon's SUV pulled into Douglas Carter's quiet driveway. Brittany insisted on coming. If we're fixing this, we're doing it together. The engine shut off. Neither of them moved. Rain hammered the windshield. Finally, Brandon opened the door. Cold wind hit them immediately. They hurried toward the front porch, already soaked before reaching the steps. Then, bang! Brandon pounded on the front door. Again and again. Dad! His voice echoed through the storm. Open the door. No response. He hit the door even harder. I know you're in there. A house filled with peace. Inside, Douglas Carter calmly closed the book resting on his lap. A small reading lamp illuminated the living room. Beside him sat a cup of tea that had long since gone cold. Outside, thunder rolled across the night sky. He recognized the sound of Brandon's vehicle the moment it entered the driveway. He wasn't surprised. In fact, he'd expected this visit, not because Brandon suddenly understood, but because consequences had finally become real. Douglas stood slowly. There was no anger on his face, no excitement, just quiet determination. He walked toward the front door, unlocked the deadbolt, turned the handle. The door opened only halfway. Standing on the porch were Brandon and Brittany, completely soaked. Rainwater dripped from Brandon's expensive dress shirt. Brittany's mascara had run down her cheeks, leaving dark streaks beneath her eyes. Neither looked anything like the confident couple who had hosted a glamorous barbecue only hours earlier. For several seconds, no one spoke. Finally, Brandon broke the silence. Dad! His voice cracked. We need to talk. Douglas looked at both of them calmly. I imagine you do. Without waiting for permission, Brandon stepped inside. Brittany followed immediately. Cold air rushed into the hallway. Douglas quietly closed the door behind them. Then, he locked it. The loud click of the deadbolt echoed through the silent house. Brandon spun around. His emotions exploded. What is wrong with you? You've lost your mind. Douglas remained perfectly still. No, I've finally found it. Brandon threw both arms into the air. You embarrassed us. You humiliated us. You sent legal papers to my house. In front of everyone. Our friends were there. Douglas looked at him steadily. I know. You knew. You planned that. I planned to have the documents legally delivered. What day they arrived depended on the courier. Brittany stepped forward, her voice trembling with anger. We had to send everyone home. We had to lie. My friends think Brandon got sick. Douglas folded his hands behind his back. That's unfortunate. Unfortunate, she shouted. You destroyed our weekend. Douglas' expression never changed. No, I interrupted the fantasy. The room fell silent. Those 5 words landed harder than any shout could have. Brandon stared at his father. For the first time in his life, he realized the man standing before him wasn't going to apologize. And what happened next would force every buried truth into the open. In the next chapter, Brandon and Douglas's confrontation reaches its breaking point as decades of resentment, sacrifice, entitlement, and painful family secrets finally explode into the open. The line that could never be crossed again. The silence inside my house felt heavier than the rain pounding against the windows. Brandon stood in the middle of my living room, his soaked clothes dripping onto the hardwood floor. Brittany folded her arms tightly across her chest, trying to hide the fear growing behind her anger. Neither of them had come to understand. They had come to negotiate. And that was their first mistake. You can't treat family like tenants. Brandon pointed toward me, his hand trembling. Do you even realize what you've done? We were humiliated. Our friends watched everything fall apart. You made us look like fools. I looked at him calmly. I didn't make you look like anything. I simply stopped protecting the lie. His jaw tightened. You sent eviction papers to my house. I sent legal documents to the people living in a house I own. That's different. Brittany stepped forward before Brandon could answer. You can't honestly think this is normal. We're your family. You don't evict family. I nodded slowly. No, I hold family accountable. Her face turned bright red. We've lived there for 5 years. We made that place a home. I painted every bedroom. I designed the kitchen. I planted the garden. It belongs to us. I couldn't help but sigh. Brittany, you decorated the house. You didn't buy it. The deed doesn't change because someone picks paint colors. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. For years, she had spoken about the property as if it were hers. Tonight, she was hearing the truth for the first time. The documents don't lie. I walked into my study and returned carrying the blue trust folder. Without saying a word, I placed it on the coffee table. Brandon frowned. What is that? The truth. He opened the folder. Inside were property records, trust agreements, financial statements, mortgage documents, every legal record connected to the house. He flipped through page after page, then stopped. What is this? He pointed toward one paragraph. Occupancy rights. I nodded. You had permission to live there. Nothing more. His breathing became heavier. No, there has to be something else. There isn't. You've never owned that house. You never paid the mortgage. You never paid the property taxes. You never carried the insurance. You simply lived there. The room fell completely silent. Brandon kept reading. Every page confirmed exactly what I had just said. Everything he'd proudly called his legally belonged to the Carter family trust. The excuses begin. Brittany suddenly found her voice. We invested money into that house. We remodeled the kitchen. We upgraded the flooring. We spent thousands. I looked directly at her. Using whose money? She hesitated. Our savings. I slowly opened another folder. Inside sat a promissory note, signed 2 years earlier. Loan amount, $40,000. Borrower, Brandon Carter. Purpose, home improvements. Repayment status, outstanding. I slid the paper across the table. You mean this money? Brittany's face went pale. She recognized the document immediately. You kept that. I keep every agreement. Brandon rubbed both hands across his face. Dad, we were going to pay you back. Were you? I asked quietly. When? He couldn't answer, because there had never been a plan. There had only been assumptions. Assumptions that I would eventually forget. Assumptions that family mint debts disappeared. The child they tried to protect. Suddenly Brandon's expression changed. His anger softened. His voice cracked. Dad, this isn't about us anymore. It's about Leo. I felt my heart tighten at the sound of my grandson's name. He loves that house. It's the only home he remembers. If we leave, he loses his room, his school, his friends. Brandon looked at me with tears forming in his eyes. Please, don't do this to him. For a brief moment, the room became painfully quiet. I loved Leo more than words could ever explain. I'd built him a bookshelf with tiny dinosaur footprints carved into the sides. I still hadn't given it to him. The thought alone nearly broke me. But then another thought appeared. What kind of example was Leo watching? A father who expected rescue? A family living beyond its means? A grandfather constantly fixing problems that others refused to solve? If nothing changed, Leo would grow up believing the responsibility belonged to someone else. I couldn't allow that. I took a slow breath. I love Leo. You know that. Brandon nodded quickly. Then don't do this. I'm doing this because I love him. Both Brandon and Brittany looked confused. What? He deserves parents who stand on their own. He deserves to see hard work. He deserves honesty. He deserves responsibility. Not a childhood built on someone else's paycheck. Neither of them spoke, because deep down, they knew I was right. The final threat. The silence lasted only a few seconds. Then Brandon's sadness disappeared. Anger returned. Cold, sharp, dangerous. If you don't stop this, he said slowly, you'll never see Leo again. The words echoed through the room. Brittany looked at him in surprise. Even she hadn't expected him to say it. I looked into my son's eyes. There was desperation there. Fear, pride, and one final attempt to regain control. He thought he'd found my weakness. Instead, he had crossed the one line that should never be crossed. I stood up, slowly, calmly. Then I looked directly at him. If you use my grandson as a weapon, I won't negotiate. I'll fight. Brandon swallowed hard. What does that mean? It means I will protect Leo, even if I have to protect him from his own parents. Neither of them moved. Neither of them spoke. The storm outside continued raging. Lightning flashed across the windows. For the first time that night, it wasn't the weather making Brandon afraid. It was realizing his father had finally become someone he could no longer manipulate. And he still had no idea that the biggest shock of his life was only moments away. Because in the next chapter, Douglas reveals a secret Brandon never imagined. A truth about his career, his success, and the powerful connection that had been protecting him all along. The secret behind Brandon's success. The room fell into complete silence. Rain pounded relentlessly against the windows, but no one inside seemed to notice anymore. Brandon stood frozen. Brittany looked from me to him, trying to figure out what would happen next. Moments earlier, my son had threatened to keep Leo away from me. Now, he was waiting for my response. I looked directly into his eyes. There was sadness there, but there was also something else. Resolve. The kind that only comes after years of disappointment. I slowly walked toward the fireplace and rested one hand on the mantel. When you were little, I began quietly, I taught you something. Brandon frowned. What are you talking about? I told you that every action has consequences. He crossed his arms. So now you're giving me another lecture? No, I'm giving you the truth. The truth about his career. I turned and faced him. Tell me something, Brandon. How did you get your job at Apex Construction? He looked confused. What kind of question is that? I interviewed. I earned it. Did you? His confidence wavered. Of course I did. I have the experience. The qualifications. I've closed million-dollar contracts. I nodded. You believe that. What does that mean? It means you've never asked why a 27-year-old with average experience became vice president ahead of people who'd worked there for 20 years. Brandon laughed nervously. Because I'm good at my job. I didn't answer. Instead, I looked toward Brittany. Did Brandon ever tell you how he got hired? She shrugged. He said the company recognized his talent. I smiled sadly. That's what he believed. Brandon's voice grew sharper. Stop talking in riddles. If you got something to say, say it. I took a slow breath, then finally spoke the words I'd kept hidden for years. I made one phone call. The room became perfectly still. What? I called the company's investors. I recommended you. Brandon shook his head. No, they hired me because I earned it. They interviewed you because of me. They promoted you because of me. They trusted you because I asked them to. His face lost all color. You're lying. I wish I were. The silent partner. Brandon took a step closer. What exactly are you saying? I'm saying Apex Construction didn't simply hire you. They honored a commitment. He stared at me. I don't understand. You remember the expansion project 5 years ago? The one that doubled the company's size? He nodded slowly. Yes, I funded part of it. Brittany frowned. What? I became a silent investor. Neither of them spoke. The company needed capital. I provided it. In return, I received an ownership interest. Brandon blinked repeatedly. No, that's impossible. You never told me. You never asked. His breathing became heavier. So, you're telling me you own part of the company? I own enough to influence major decisions. His knees nearly buckled. Everything he believed about his career suddenly felt uncertain. Every promotion, every bonus, every executive title. Questions flooded his mind. Had he really earned them? Or had someone quietly opened every door? The investment with one condition. I walked toward the bookshelf and removed a thin black folder. Inside rested the original investment agreement. I handed it to Brandon. He quickly flipped through the pages, then stopped. His eyes locked onto one paragraph. His lips began moving silently as he read. Finally, he whispered, "No." I nodded. It was one condition. Brittany stepped beside him. What does it say? Brandon couldn't answer. I answered for him. My investment required the company to give you an opportunity. Not a guarantee. An opportunity. You still had to show up. You still had to work. But that first opportunity, I created it. Brandon looked as though the floor had disappeared beneath him. My entire career, I interrupted gently. No, your career was real, but your starting line wasn't. His shoulders sagged. For the first time in years, his confidence cracked. The decision already made. Brittany suddenly found her voice. Phoenix. So you helped him. Parents help their children. That doesn't mean you can destroy his career. I looked directly at her. I haven't destroyed anything. Yet, Brandon slowly raised his head. What does that mean? It means I made another phone call. His eyes widened. When? Yesterday. The room instantly became tense. What did you do? I informed the board that my confidence in your leadership no longer exists. Brandon's heartbeat pounded in his ears. You? No, you wouldn't. I already did. His breathing became rapid. They can't fire me. They can restructure. They can eliminate positions. They can withdraw investor support. You, his voice cracked, would ruin my life. I shook my head slowly. No, I'm removing the safety net. What happens after that depends entirely on you. A son meets reality. For nearly a full minute, no one spoke. Brandon looked down at the investment agreement, still trembling in his hands. His entire identity had been built on one belief, that he'd earned everything alone. Now, he wasn't sure where his own accomplishments ended and where his father's sacrifices began. He looked older somehow, not physically, emotionally, like someone seeing himself clearly for the very first time. Then he whispered, when? I looked at him. What? When will they tell me? I answered honestly. Monday morning. His eyes closed. A painful silence settled over the room. Monday, less than 48 hours away. He imagined walking into the office, greeting co-workers, planning meetings, completely unaware that everything had already changed. He opened his eyes again. Dad, for the first time that night, there was no anger in his voice, only fear, real fear. But some lessons arrived too late to stop the consequences. And this was one of them. What Brandon didn't know was that Monday morning would become the worst day of his professional life. While one team prepared to photograph the house he was losing, another prepared to escort him out of the office where he'd built his career. Both disasters were about to unfold at exactly the same time. We're reaching one of the biggest turning points in this story. Before we continue, tell me this. Do you think Douglas went too far? Or was he finally holding Brandon accountable? Share your opinion in the comments. I read as many as I can. And if you're enjoying this story, don't forget to like, subscribe to Royal Rich Chronicles, and turn on notifications, because Chapter 10 delivers the dramatic Monday morning neither father nor son will ever forget. The message that finally changed everything. Monday morning arrived with a cold, gray sky hanging over the city. For Douglas Carter, it was surprisingly peaceful. He stood in his backyard holding a warm cup of coffee, watching the sunrise filter through the maple trees his late wife had planted decades earlier. For the first time in years, he wasn't carrying someone else's burdens. He wasn't waiting for an emergency phone call. He wasn't wondering whose bills needed paying next. Instead, he was learning something he'd almost forgotten: how to live for himself. But across town, Brandon's world was falling apart. The hardest morning of his life. Brandon barely slept. Dark circles surrounded his eyes as he drove toward Apex Construction's headquarters. His mind raced with every possible scenario. Maybe Dad was bluffing. Maybe the board wouldn't listen. Maybe nothing had changed. He repeated those thoughts over and over as he entered the sleek glass office building. The receptionist smiled politely. Good morning, Mr. Carter. He forced a smile in return. Morning. Everything looked normal. Employees greeted him. Phones hung. Coffee machines hummed. For one brief moment, he convinced himself that everything would be okay. Then his assistant approached. Mr. Carter, the executive board is waiting for you. His heart skipped a beat. Right now, immediately, a wake-up call. Inside the conference room sat 6 board members. No one smiled. No one offered coffee. No one made small talk. The chairman spoke first. Brandon, we appreciate everything you've contributed over the years. Whenever conversations begin that way, they rarely end well. The chairman continued. Due to recent organizational changes and investor restructuring, we've decided to remove you from your executive position. Brandon stared in disbelief. What? This isn't a termination. You'll remain employed, but you'll return to a project management role. His salary would be reduced. His executive privileges would end. His company vehicle would be returned. His performance would now determine every future promotion. No shortcuts, no special treatment, no hidden safety net. for the first time in his professional life. His future depended entirely on his own abilities. Brandon wanted to argue. He wanted to demand answers. But deep inside, he already knew why this was happening. His father hadn't destroyed his career. He had removed the invisible hand that had quietly protected it. A different kind of victory. That same afternoon, professional photographers arrived at the Oak Creek Drive house. They carefully photographed every room. The spacious kitchen, the elegant living room, the landscape backyard, the place Brandon once believed would belong to his family forever. As he watched strangers preparing the property for sale, something unexpected happened. He stopped feeling angry. Instead, he felt ashamed, not because he was losing the house, because he had spent years believing it was his. He remembered every time he'd proudly told friends, "I bought this." Every compliment he'd accepted, every moment he'd taken credit for sacrifices that weren't his own. For the first time, he saw the truth clearly. One final visit. 3 weeks later, the moving truck pulled away. Brandon, Brittany, and Leo had moved into a modest 3-bedroom rental home across town. It wasn't luxurious. There were no marble countertops, no grand staircase, no oversized backyard. But for the first time, every bill belonged to them. Every payment came from their own hard work. That Saturday afternoon, Brandon stood outside his father's front door. This time, he carried no legal documents, no bills, no request for money. Only the small dinosaur bookshelf Douglas had built months earlier. It had been sitting in the garage all along. Brandon had found it while packing. The tiny dinosaur footprints carved into the sides nearly brought him to tears. He knocked gently. Douglas opened the door. For several seconds, neither man spoke. Finally, Brandon looked down. "I am sorry." Not a speech, not an excuse, just 2 simple words. "I spent years confusing your generosity with obligation. I thought success meant having expensive things. But now I realize success is becoming the kind of man who earns them." Douglas felt his eyes fill with tears. He stepped forward, pulled his son into a hug. The first real hug they'd shared in years. Then a small voice interrupted. "Grandpa." Leo ran up the walkway carrying a toy dinosaur. Douglas knelt and opened his arms. His grandson crashed into him with the biggest smile he'd seen in months. "I missed you." Douglas laughed through tears. "I missed you too, buddy." He handed Leo the handmade bookshelf. "I made this just for you." Leo's eyes lit up. The dinosaur footprints. They're awesome. Watching his son and grandson together, Brandon finally understood what his father had been trying to protect all along. It had never been the money. It had been the family. The richest legacy. People often believe the greatest inheritance parents leave behind is money. But Douglas Carter discovered something far more valuable. Money can build houses. It can buy cars. It can open doors. But it cannot purchase respect. It cannot replace character. And it certainly cannot create gratitude. Sometimes the greatest act of love isn't giving someone everything they want. Sometimes it's giving them the opportunity to become the person they were always capable of being. Months later, Brandon was working harder than ever. His promotions were now earned through dedication instead of hidden favors. Brittany had returned to work, and together they managed their household budget responsibly. They no longer lived in luxury, but they lived with dignity. Every bill they paid brought a sense of pride they had never experienced before. Douglas continued spending weekends with Leo, teaching him woodworking in the same garage where this journey had begun. One afternoon, Leo looked up while sanding a small wooden dinosaur. "Grandpa, why do you always say to measure twice before cutting?" Douglas smiled warmly. "Because mistakes are easier to prevent than to fix." Leo nodded thoughtfully. "I'll remember that." Douglas looked at his grandson and quietly smiled. Maybe that would become the greatest inheritance of all. Not money, not property, but wisdom. And that legacy would last far longer than any house ever could. Thank you so much for watching this story on Royal Rich Chronicles. If this journey touched your heart or reminded you of someone in your own life, let us know in the comments. We'd love to hear your name, where you're watching from, and what lesson from this story stayed with you the most. If you enjoyed this emotional story, please like, subscribe to Royal Rich Chronicles, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another inspiring tale of success, family, resilience, and life's greatest lessons. Until next time, remember, true wealth isn't measured by what you own, it's measured by the character you leave behind.